The VORTEX StrikeEagle 3-18x44 is a first focal plane MPVO that comes in right around $750. That's a lot of money. When you think that the PST Gen 2s that have been out for the better part of a decade at this point cost a little bit more than this, it makes you wonder, is this Chinese MPVO really worth it? That is a good question, and one that we are going to answer in this video. There's going to be a lot to talk about because this scope I had had for quite some time and ended up sending it back to Vortex under warranty concerns because there's something with the image that I just couldn't put my finger on. But more on that very soon. Let's see what comes inside the box and go from there. The box is typical Vortex. Good. Lots of information, very well illustrated, and put together quite well. Inside is what really counts, but the outside gives you all the useful information that you might ever have to question on this scope right there in front of you. Inside, we find ourselves with a very standard Vortex layout. The scope comes with bikini caps, a nice throw lever, and that nice thick foam that's going to keep it all nice, safe, and sound. Inside, we also find the standard owner's manual and Reticle Overview booklet. This is the EBR-7c, and I do think that it is a little bit too fine for the 3 to 18 magnification range, but you'll see that for yourself very soon. These booklets are fantastic wealths of information because if you have any question about either the scope or the reticle itself, boom, it's right there in the box. Now, I did buy this scope secondhand, and you can very clearly see that it was pre-loved kind of well. Everything else was in good working order, or so I thought. Again, with this thing, I did send it into Vortex to get tested out to see if everything was going to be okay with it, because again, the image just didn't seem right. They did replace it with a brand new one, so I do have some side-by-side comparisons between this version and the new one to see if it really did make a difference. The fast focus eyepiece on this is nice and tight, which is exactly how I want all of my eyepieces to be. Magnification ring wise, it is exactly 180 degrees, which is completely standard. The Vortex branded throw lever is included and a very nice touch. You absolutely need a throw lever on this thing. The splines on it are decent to grab if you had to grab it, but having a throw lever just makes your life so much easier. So Vortex, thank you at least for including that in the box. The magnification ring, just like the fast focus eyepiece, is nice, tight, and damped very well with no weird feelings or sounds. The EBR-7c is an illuminated reticle, and you can very clearly see that the illumination control goes from 0 to 11 with only that one off. So if you like having offs in between on your illumination controls, look elsewhere. I do appreciate that they put different textures on the illumination control versus the side parallax. You have nice, deep, sharp knurling on the illumination control, and again, nice, deep, sharp splines on the side parallax. So choosing which one is which is very easy if you had to do so blindfolded. The illumination control definitely does feel a little bit on the softer side. It does require a lot of effort to turn, but the detents do seem very shallow and not very positive. It's not the most confidence-inspiring dial, but I'm sure you will never have a problem with it. Another nice thing that I do appreciate that Vortex did was completely recess the battery compartment cover. You need to have a special tool and or a coin to access it, and there's no worries of ever accidentally opening it if you ever had to adjust the illumination control. A big win in my book. Removing the cap on the battery compartment, and you see we have a standard 3-leaf spring on top of the cap, and underneath the standard CR2032 battery, we have a 3-dimple PCB board underneath. Again, completely standard and found on almost every sort of inexpensive scope, but I have yet to have a problem with one of these battery compartments, so I have no problem with it. A nice big fat O-ring keeps everything nice and watertight, so hopefully you shouldn't have any issues either. The side parallax knob on this thing goes down to a minimum of 10 yards and out to infinity, and it's about a 180 degree sweep, which is pretty good. There isn't a whole lot of adjustment on this, but it's partly due to just the magnification range. The knob does feel well damped and pretty tight. There is no weird sort of feelings or sounds to it. Again, it is perfectly fine. If you're fans of my channel, you know that if I have a mid-powered variable optic like this 3 to 18, I like 3 things. I like the windage to be capped, the elevation to be locking, and the reticle to be a Christmas tree. This scope has all 3, so right off the bat, I am very pleased with it. Removing the cap on the windage turret reveals a very nice slimline turret. It's small, but yet it keeps all of the useful information, and it keeps enough of the splines on the outside that you have a very good positive purchase on it if you did have to adjust it. And when you do adjust it, you have a nice solid sound and feel. They're very tight and very responsive. Very, very nice. From there, we move on to the elevation turret. And this thing has the exact same sounding and feeling and looking turret as the 5-25 StrikeEagle, which is really no surprise there. There is a fair amount of wiggle when it is both deployed and stowed, and unfortunately, due to the design of the turret, there's nothing you can really do about that. However, when you do disengage the lock on it and make an adjustment on the elevation turret, it has a good sound and a good feel to it. I would say that the turrets are more than sufficient on this thing, but given the price point of $750, it really does put it against some very stiff competition, which we will be taking a look at very soon. But first, let's get behind this thing and see what this reticle looks like. The EBR-7c reticle, as seen here in the first focal plane setup at 3x, in my opinion and to my eye, is very small and fine. This is the same reticle that you could find on many other 5-25 Vortex products, and I really do feel that the 5-25 magnification range for this reticle is a much better suited magnification range as opposed to this 3-18. At 3x, it does seem to get a little bit lost. Those posts at 3, 6, and 9 are fairly large and do help draw your eye to the center, but the center is just a bit of a cobbled mess. There's just way too much information going on, and even with the illumination set to full, it's not really going to help you figure out where the center is. The reticle really starts to come alive around 10x, but all the way up at 18x, it still looks a little bit on the more cluttered side, especially those horizontal posts on the windage. It just seems really clustered and not very well situated. The illumination on this thing is also a little bit on the weaker side. It's a brand new CR2032 battery, and this is about as good as you're ever going to get from it. Now again, this is still a serving size of 1 for the time being. I did send this in, like I said, and get a new one from Vortex, but the illumination still performed exactly the same. For most mid to high powered variable optics, I would say it's more than fine in most cases. But again, with how the reticle is lined up and situated here, I don't think it's really that great. As you can very clearly see, there's a lot of slop whether the turret is locked or unlocked. There is a decent sound and decent feel to it, and again, I would normally say this is okay, but for $750, you can get a lot better. The turrets might not fill me full of confidence, but the way the reticle lines up to my target absolutely does. Towards the bottom right, you could see it's off a little bit. That could have been me not having it perfectly oriented as far as clocking, but beyond that, it does line up exceptionally well, much better than most, even some from the Razor HD series, especially the Gen 2s. They were always seemed to be like a half of a tenth or a tenth off at best. Doing a step test, 4 over and 4 down, you can see that so far so good. It's lining up exactly where it needs to be. 4 up and 4 over, and we are basically at a perfect performance. Resetting the windage, and we also again find ourselves at the perfect 0. Continuing the trend on up to 10 full mils of total added elevation, and you can see when we get down to 10 mils, we are about a click off or 1% off. That is a very good performance. Factor that in along with the fact that there's no erector slop that I was able to see, and this thing really does shine quite well. All in all, this is a very good performance. Like I've already mentioned numerous times, this did go back in for warranty work. Vortex ended up just replacing the optic completely, and I was very excited when they said that they were going to do that, primarily because when I got behind this thing for the first few times, above 10x, I found it to be quite challenging to get behind. I just could not get a really good view through the scope. It was kind of hard to explain. The image looked murky to me all the time, even though it didn't really perceive that way. It was just off. I even had a few of my close friends get behind it, and they all agreed with me it was kind of off. It just seemed hard to get behind above 10x, especially my one friend that has the StrikeEagle 5-25, who's the one that lent it in to me so I could review it. He said, this just seems way more challenging than the 5-25 at the same magnifications. Nevertheless, what you were looking through right, I think the biggest thing is this is a 6x multiplier and the 5-25 is a 5x multiplier. I do believe they are running the same glass. Don't quote me, they might not be. But for the price point, I'd imagine that they're using similar glass just with a higher magnifier inside. And that makes all the difference in the world. At the very end of this video, after the comparisons between this scope and all the other scopes that I could recommend other than this, I will be showing you a side-by-side between the pre-warranty and the post-warranty worked 3-18. But right now, this is still the pre-warranted one. Very clearly, the tail end of winter. Year ago. Yeah, it's been a long time waiting for this one. But we are now going to transition into the post-warranted 3-18, and we will continue using this footage for the rest of the video. Unfortunately, the new one did the exact same thing as the old one, and I think, again, that just had to do with the fact that this is a 6x multiplier as opposed to a 5x. That's really only it. At 400 yards here, the image looks good, but not great. I do adjust the side parallax just enough to bring it in as close to possible. The colors look pretty good. The contrast is a little bit on the muted side. There is a touch of chromatic aberration that's creeping up on the high contrast areas, and we will see more of that when we get to large bore. But in the grand scheme of things, it's just an okay image for the most part. It never really wowed me. Below 10x, it's very good. Above 10x, it just gets soft. The reticle, again, is going to be completely personal, but if you're not a fan of what this reticle looks like, you're going to have to go with another option scope because this is all you could really get for this. That's going to be a topic for its own separate video because a lot of scope manufacturers, to me, are just being really lazy with their reticle choices for different magnification ranges for their scopes. This reticle is great in a 5-25. I think in a 3-18, it's just really not calibrated properly for it. One of the main reasons why I believe that this thing is hard to get behind above 10x is probably its exit pupil. Vortex claims, or at least on a few websites that I've found, Vortex claims that this thing has a minimum exit pupil of 2.4 millimeters here at 18x. To put that into retrospect for you, if I was to compare this to the Razor HD Gen 2, it's 2.8 millimeters, but it seems way larger than that on the Razor HD. If I was to compare that again with another such example of another great 3-18 MPVO, the Meopta Optica 6, that again has a 2.8 millimeter exit pupil at 18x. Happily, at least, the lower in magnification that we go, the larger the exit pupil goes to a maximum of 14.6 at 3x, which is quite large. As far as how the image stability actually is if you go off center, it's okay. The reticle maintains a decent level of sharpness, but the image behind it falls apart rather quickly the second you go off center. And that doesn't really change until you get all the way down to 3x at the minimum. Here, it performs as one would expect. Almost every scope that we've seen, it performs well enough. It's adequate. But again, in the higher magnifications, the harder it is to get behind. It's yet again one of those just mediocre performances. Let's take a look at this thing in a more dynamic approach, and starting with 3x, you can see that getting behind it is still pretty decent. We can get pretty far away from it and still look through it. However, the threshold of perfect eye relief is still pretty narrow. A lot of other scopes in this sort of segment, you'd be able to move in and out a little bit easier than that. 10x is where things will start to get much tighter and fall apart, as you can see from there. It's, at best, it's average, but it's a little bit worse than that. 18x over here at the top end is going to be less than average. This is tighter and a little bit more finicky to get behind than a lot of other 3-18s from my experiences. And it's part of the reason why I think it's so hard to use at the higher magnifications. A great place that I can showcase another example is at 1,000 yards at 18x. Currently we have 0 mils of added elevation, and the image, all things considered, is quite good. The colors are definitely on the more muted side, but we have decent sharpness and resolution out here at 1,000 yards. A slight bit of chromatic aberration on some of the very high contrast areas, but very, very minimal in these lighting conditions. It's all relevant on lighting conditions and how badly you're going to perceive any sort of purple fringing or any sort of chromatic aberration. Adding 10 mils of elevation like I normally do and then reacquiring our 0, you will see that the image does get a very weird shade of purple. That is because the exit pupil has shifted and I have to compensate where the camera is behind the scope to accommodate for that. You can see just from moving the scope up and down ever so slightly how much of a dramatic effect that has on the image quality looking through it. Again, it's just par for the course with how the scope is currently set up, and there's nothing we could really do about it. Another area where this scope suffers a little bit is in low light environments. This is a much lower light environment than I originally wanted, but unfortunately I had to make do with what I had. Adjusting the side parallax just so we can make that window look very sharp and clear, which is at least pretty nice. Illumination on maximum is more than bright enough for these conditions, and the illumination does fill out the reticle nice, clearly, evenly, and fairly sharply, so it's more than adequate. The spacing between all of the brightness levels is also very good, so you can probably find the exact brightness setting that you are looking for in these environments. I pan the whole rig down so we can see that concrete wall on the side. It's a little bit brighter, and as I slowly start to pull back the magnification, you will see just how much brighter it gets the lower in magnification that we go. Again, just showcasing just how dark this thing gets above 10x specifically. It's almost like you flip a switch when you get behind this thing. 10x just seems to be like a hard stop, and everything above that just sort of falls apart. I jockey the magnification ring back and forth to give you a much better example of what I'm trying to talk about. Keep in mind, folks, the camera has a fixed f-stop or iris size. Our eyes do not have a fixed iris size. So the darker it gets and the larger our iris gets, the more challenging it's going to be getting behind a scope with a smaller exit pupil. Finally, on to everybody's favorite segment of my videos, the side-by-side comparisons. On the left will be the StrikeEagle. On the right, we're going to start off with the Meopta Optica 6, and why not start with the best? Now, I love the Meopta Optica 6. I've had it for many years. I have thousands of rounds through it. I've beaten it up all the time, and it just works. The MRAD1 reticle, I believe, still is one of the best reticles for this magnification range. Just look at these two side by side real quick. You can easily tell where the sensor for the MRAD1 is on the Optica, as opposed to the StrikeEagle. You really have to look for it. That donut on the Optica is just basically perfect. That center crosshair, a little fine dot, still allows for super precise shots and dialing. But I know for all you DMR guys, you might prefer how the StrikeEagle reticle looks, especially in the higher magnification ranges. Personal preference aside though, let's talk some cold hard facts. They're both about the same price. Lengthwise, the Meopta is about an inch longer at 14.6 inches, whereas the StrikeEagle is at 13.3. Weight-wise, the StrikeEagle is going to be about 3 ounces lighter, but that's only 10%. As far as field of view, it definitely has to go to the StrikeEagle. At 3x, the StrikeEagle is at 39.3 feet. The Meopta is at 33.5 feet. That is pretty substantial, even though when you're looking at it here, it really doesn't look all that different. As far as our field of view at our maximum of 18x at 100 yards, again, the StrikeEagle has a 6.7 foot field of view to the Meopta's 5.8. Now, as far as the exit pupil is concerned, the Meopta is only 9.5 measured. I haven't measured these personally, to 14.6 at 3x. But again, at 18x, the Meopta is going to be 2.8 versus 2.4. Eye relief on the Meopta is also going to be 3.9 inches versus the StrikeEagle's 3.7. So it's going to give you a more generous eye relief getting behind the Meopta, and thus you should be able to get a little more comfortable behind it. And that's part of the calculation as to why the field of view is going to be a little bit off, because the longer the scope is, the farther away from your eye it is. Generally, the smaller the view looking through it, or rather, the smaller the field of view downrange. However, numbers are just numbers. Sometimes they're very important when we are doing a side-by-side comparison like this, but getting behind the Optica seems much easier and much more forgiving. The controls are all nicer with the Meopta as opposed to the StrikeEagle. I've never had to warranty the Meopta. I've never had a problem with it. Could the warranty not be as good as VORTEX's? Absolutely. VORTEX is world-renowned for having an incredible warranty. Glass-wise, and forgiving wise, I have to give it to the Meopta. It's just a better overall package as far as I'm concerned. And for the price point, it's only about $50 to $100 more expensive than the StrikeEagle, but the Meoptas are apparently made in the US using German or this European glass, whereas the StrikeEagle is made in China. That's going to have a big impact for a lot of you. Between these two, I personally have to go with the Meopta. It's proven itself time and time again, and is still, in my opinion, a benchmark for a near bulletproof MPVO. So you want to still get a slightly smaller MPVO in the 3-18, 4-16 magnification range, but you want to save some money and you're still looking for something that's going to perform quite well. I'm going to recommend for you then the Primary Arms SLX 4-16x44. This is a 30mm tube as opposed to a 34, so it's going to be a little bit smaller in that regard and a little bit lighter. Lengthwise, it's going to be 14¼ inches versus 13.3, so a little bit longer, but optically, damn, that SLX looks the business. It looks the part. It also manages to come in 2 ounces lighter than the StrikeEagle and have a field of view that, in retrospect, isn't anything crazy or wild, but it's adequate for the magnification range. As far as the exit pupil goes, the exit pupil is going to actually go to the StrikeEagle down low, again, because you have that extra 1x. And on top, they're basically about on par with one another. The SLX at 16x is 2.7 millimeters versus with the StrikeEagle at 18x is 2.4 millimeters. Eye relief on the SLX is going to be in between 3.6 to 3.9 inches, whereas the StrikeEagle is going to be right at 3.7, right smack dab in the middle. Now, it's true, the SLX doesn't have all the same features as the StrikeEagle, but the SLX also comes in less than half the price. As near as makes no difference, a third the price of the StrikeEagle. And is the price savings going to showcase that the SLX is a lesser quality scope because it's so much less expensive? I don't necessarily think so. It does everything that I was looking for quite well. It tracked very good. The glass on it is exceptionally high quality. I like the reticle, but don't love the reticle. I do believe that it could be tweaked a little bit more. But if you're in the market for an MPVO and you're not looking to spend $700 or $800, something like the SLX to keep a small, lighter package is going to be something that I would recommend. You can still go with an Arkin SH4 Gen 2 4-16x50, but those are going to be a little bit on the heavier side, and they're going to cost about the same price as the SLX, but I feel like that's more of a precision-ish style scope, again, because it's 10 ounces heavier than the SLX, but it also doesn't offer that many more features as opposed to the SLX. So take it for what it's worth. I'm going with the SLX over the StrikeEagle for the price savings and its overall performance. And it's something that I've recommended to a lot of people, and a lot of people have enjoyed them. So I guess it just works. On to another primary arm scope and on to another 3-18x44. This GLX is basically the direct competitor to the StrikeEagle. They're, as near as makes no difference, the same price. They're as near as makes no difference, the same length. They're as near as makes no difference, the same weight. In fact, almost everything on these two side by side, paper to paper, is pretty close to one another, with the exception of the field of view. At 3x, we have 36.7 feet on the GLX versus 39.3 with the StrikeEagle. And at the maximum of 18x, we lose, again, 10% at 6.1 feet versus 6.7 feet. As far as the exit pupil goes, GLX is only rated at 9.3 millimeters at 3x, but they are exactly the same at their maximums at 2.4 millimeter. I don't know why I threw an accent on that, but I did. Eye relief is going to be 3.5 inches on the GLX versus 3.7 on the StrikeEagle, and I have to be honest with all of you, I do not like the GLX in this configuration at all. The image here side by side might look pretty decent, but getting behind it is even more challenging than the StrikeEagle. I had actually bought it and then returned it because I thought, hey, this would make a great comparison to the StrikeEagle. Let me just buy it and I'm sure I'll like it. I did not. I liked the StrikeEagle more than the GLX. It was, all things considered, easier to get behind and had a better looking image. The GLX on camera doesn't look terrible, but getting behind it just never looked right to me. It does have some areas where it is a little bit better. I prefer the controls and the physical features of the GLX way more than the StrikeEagle, and you'll see that on the full review coming soon. But optically, even though the StrikeEagle isn't great, the GLX wasn't as good. And it really threw me for a loop because I had just finished reviewing the SLX that I had just did a comparison with against this thing, and I preferred it. And I thought the GLX, I was hoping the GLX would be better, and it just isn't. The illumination is weaker. The reticle is basically about the same as the EBR-7c, and I didn't like how small the view was looking through it. For this price point, I'd much rather go with the Meopta. In fact, I'd much rather have the StrikeEagle over the GLX in this consideration. And again, all the same friends that I had look through the StrikeEagle, look through the GLX, and they were all like, this thing looks muddy. I'm like, yeah, it's just not a great scope to use. So there you go. The StrikeEagle actually wins something. Just for the hell of it, I'm going to roll in the Nightforce ATACR 4-16x42. And the reason why I'm going to roll this in is because it is still, if I had to buy a single scope to own, use, and just cherish and enjoy, it would still probably be the ATACR 4-16. There's something about the scope that transcends words. It's excellent. It's really, really excellent. Yes, it's $2,500. It is, as near as makes no difference, 3 times the price of the StrikeEagle. But if you want to buy a very high quality American-made 4-16 specifically, look no further than this ATACR. It is going to have the same tube size, 34mm. Of course, it's going to be more expensive. Lengthwise, the ATACR is actually going to be about 3/4 of an inch shorter at 12.6 inches. Weight-wise, it's going to be about 3 ounces heavier than StrikeEagle. Field of view is going to be a little hard to gauge, again, because they're different magnification ranges. But at the minimum, you got 26.9 feet and 6.9 feet at the maximum. Exit pupil is going to be 10.3 to 2.7 on the ATACR and 14.6 to 2.4 on the StrikeEagle. So it's really not that far off, all things considered. Eye relief on these are going to be within a 1/4 inch of one another. Believe it or not, the view through the ATACR is much smaller, but that helps increase the resolution of the glass, which is why everything looks so sharp and clear. The StrikeEagle, again, it's not terrible, but it's not great. For the price, there are some other stiff competitors to it, especially in the 3 to 18 magnification range, but the winner for me is going to be the Meopta. But is this StrikeEagle a bad scope? That's the real question. Is it worth the $750? For me, it's not. I think there's plenty of other competition out there of scopes that are of higher quality in one way, shape, or form, or scopes that are made in a country other than China that I would prefer spending the money on, aka Meopta Optica 6. And I just think that it's up against some very stiff competition. It's a good scope, but it's not a great scope. If I was going to look seriously at this 3 to 18 StrikeEagle, I would actually skip right past this and buy the 5 to 25. Because at the bottom end, okay, yeah, you're missing 2x, but then you're getting 7x more with the 5 to 25, and it's easier and better to get behind. And it has basically all the exact same features for, as near as makes no difference, the exact same price. That's right, folks. I would rather buy a 5 to 25 over a 3 to 18 in this StrikeEagle lineup. The 5 to 25 was very good. Again, comes in around the same price. Yeah, it's going to be larger, it's going to be heavier, but it's just a better overall scope if I really wanted to get into a Vortex product of this sort of price category. Vortex is coming out with a new lineup of scopes very soon. In fact, they just released the Viper HD, but I have no real knowledge on those. I have no real experience with those, but nevertheless, I'd rather just have the 5 to 25 if I wanted to stick with the Vortex lineup, like I said. If I wanted to stick with the 3 to 18 lineup and I wanted to keep it more or less kind of sort of similar in the size to weight ratio, Meopta Optica 6. If I wanted a 3 to 18, I wanted the best thing that there is on the market, I'd go with the Razer HD Gen 2 3 to 18 by 50. If I wanted to save money, I'd either go with an SLX or an SH4. And save, a couple $100 that could go towards a really nice mount and a lot of ammunition. That's another key point. There's a lot of ammunition that you could buy with $400 in your pocket. I should be mentioning that what we are seeing is, well, it's pretty self-explanatory. On the left, it's pre-warranty. On the right, it's post-warranty. I do think that the post-warranty unit is a little bit better. Granted, I did film these on completely different days, weeks apart. I did most of the filming with the pre-warranty version before I was like, you know what, let me send it out to Vortex and see what they say. And like I had already mentioned, they ended up replacing it. Do I like the scope? Not really. I wanted to love it. I bought it with intentions that it would tick all of my boxes. Again, on paper, it looks really good. In person, it looks really good. And in hand, it feels pretty good. But the GLX feels way better than this thing does physically. The SLX, I think, looks better than it optically. And for the price, I'd rather just buy a Meopta. For you, it's going to be a completely different story. You might be dead set on buying this. And are you buying a scope that's worth the price point? I think for $500 all day long, but for $750, it's a bit of a hard pill to swallow. And with that, a huge thank you for all of you for staying tuned this long. I really do appreciate you. As always, see you again next time. And a huge thank you to my Patreon providers and my Subscribe Star subscribers. Without you, this truly wouldn't be possible. If you'd like to support my channel but don't want to join either of those, I completely understand. But you could still help by using my affiliate links in the description below, and or like, share, and subscribe as always. Again, thank you very much.